How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Nun Ches, Daf 58 of Masechet Nedarim. Friends, well, what can I tell you? Today we continue on the discussion that we began yesterday, which is, we had Yishmael, the man of the village of the sea. And he had an onion. And this onion was uprooted during Shemitah and then put back in the ground during the 8th year. And the question was, the additional growth of the 8th year, is it able to be mevatel the 7th year, essentially? And so can we treat this as an 8th year onion, which would not have Kedusha Shvius, or not? Or do we say that since it began as a Kedusha Shvius onion, a Kedusha Shvius onion, it remains? And we suggested that perhaps that could be a good opener for a novel. Okay. Without further ado, we're going to start on Daf Nun Zayin Beis, last line of the daf. Eliminado Tanya. Okay. So, yeah, no, exactly. So we're trying to figure out is it mevatel or not. Okay. So Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha had brought a proof from Rabbi Yanai that yes, it is mevatel, and therefore you could treat this onion as an 8th year onion. Reb Yirmiyah, some say it was taka who? Reb Zeir? Reb Zrika. So they said, I don't understand. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yonasan say that it cannot be mevatel. So now we're saying, okay, eliminado. Listen, we could prove that the additional growth would be mevatel the initial Kedusha Shvius status from here. The Tanyas from the Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon, kol davar sheyesh lo matirin, kegon tevel u'maiser sheni v'ektish v'chadash lo nosnu bo'en chachamim shir. Friends, I think we learned about this in Masechet Beya, I think. Right, that a davar sheyesh lo matirin afilu be'elef lo batil. That something that has a possibility of becoming permitted, well then it never becomes batil. Right, so we're saying, oh, somebody's going up the stairs. That's allowed. You can go up the stairs. That's alright, you can make noise going up the stairs. I really don't mind. No, it's a hard-working person schlepping a basket up the stairs. The agala. No. Kol kavod. Kol davar sheish lo matirin. Kigon, for example, tevel, untied produce. You can't eat tevel. Okay, but just separate chumas and maasros, then you can eat it. U'maiser sheni, v'hekdish. Or if you have maiser sheni, you can't eat the maiser sheni, but you can be poded, you can redeem it onto money, and then you can eat it v'hekdish. Right? Also, you could, give its value to the Beis HaMikdash. It can be poded. V'chodosh. And new stuff, right? New stuff, new grain from that year. So you just wait until the Nisan, and then you could eat it. So these are things that, yeah, maybe they're also right now, but they're not always going to be aser, and never because they're not always going to be aser. Lo nosnu ben chacham shir. Let's go weiter. V'chodav she'ein lo matir, but something that cannot become mutter. Kigon truma v'trumas ma'aser v'chalav v'orla v'kilei karim nosnu ben chacham shir. But things like truma and trumas ma'aser, right? That when you separate meiser and you give it to a Levi, the Levi then needs to separate trumas meiser. So that trumas meiser is treated like truma v'chala as well as chala, right? Right? Was it Reish Sarisusechem chala titnu truma? So chala is considered like truma. So all these things, trumas meiser, chala, they become nullified in a ratio of 200 to 1. So we see that these are things that are, truma is always going to be truma. So it has a way of being batel. You can't make it not truma. But you can nullify it 200 parts to 1. The orla v'kilei akarim. Also, when it comes to orla and kilei akarim, right, a fruit tree less than 3 years old, kilei akarim. When you mix other species into a vineyard. So also, once it's orla, right? When it's orla, right, meaning if you have this fruit, that's orla. So there's nothing, it's awesome. So kilei akarim, or something that was mixed in the vineyard, so it's also they can be bottled to a ratio of 200 to 1. Did I just make a mistake, by the way? Truma and trumas meiser chala can be bottled at a ratio of 100 parts to 1. I may have said 200 parts. 100 parts to 1. Orla and kilei akarim are 200 parts to 1. Okay, fine. So the Chacham gave a shir. So Reb Shimon says that a davar sheyesh lo matirin, there's no way of being mevatel. Davar she'ein lo matirin, it can be mevatel, right? Truma is 100 parts to 1, orlin kilei karma, 200 parts to 1. Amrulo, they said to him, hold your horses. V'halu shvius, but what about shvius? Ein lo matirin. Shvius ein lo matirin, right? If you have something that's kedusha shvius, so it's kedusha shvius. It's always going to be kedusha shvius. V'lo nosnu bo chachamim shir. And yet, there's no way to be mevatel shvius, shmita. Ditnan, as we learn in Mishnah, shvius oseris kol shu b'mina. That shvius is also kol shu b'mina, and the Ran says, for example, tarovis peiris heter b'shel shvius. Right? If you have fruits that are not kedusha shvius, that gets mixed together with fruits that are kedusha shvius, or importantly, b'gidulin kigon batzul shishis shenito b'shvius. Or for example, if you take an onion from the 6th year, which is not kedusha shvius, and then you plant it in the ground on the 7th year during Shemitah, and we're saying Oseris kol shu b'mina, it's going to make it osir. So we see that the additional growth is being mevatel the initial state, the ikr. You had this botzel, you had this onion from the 6th year, which is mutter. You planted it in the ground on the 7th year, and then it grew some. So this extra growth is being mevatel the initial growth, and we're saying that we have to treat it as kedusha shvius. So there you go. So therefore we should say also by Yishmael, the man of the village of the sea, his onion from the 7th year that he then put in the ground in the 8th year, the additional growth should be able to be mevatel the kedusha shvius. Okay. Well, that's how, so that's how we tied into our Gemara. But back in this dialogue between Reb Shimon and the Chachamim, so Reb Shimon had said that anything, right, kol davar she'ein lo matirin, then there are ways to be mevatel it, and yet we're seeing that by this onion, which is as kedusha shvius, it's not able to be batel, even though kedusha shvius is davar she'ein lo matirin. So says, so Reb Shimon responds, and the Ran has a different girsa, Afheim lo amru el levir, that when the Chachamim said that it's Osiris, it's only talking about lebiur, right? That is only talking about before. Where am I? Lo amati el levir, aval achila b'nosein tam. That when the Chachamim said that, right, in that Mishnah, when it says that the shvius is not batel, that is when, right, prior to the biur, right, you're allowed to eat, produce on Shemitah in your house until there's no more. As long as there's stuff in the field, you can keep stuff in your house. And therefore, that's what's called the zman biur, that when there's no longer stuff outside in the field, you have to be mavar, you have to get everything out of your house. But now, until that point, you can keep it in your house and you can eat it, and because you can be eating it, so it's considered davar sheish lo matirin, and therefore it's not batel ever. But after the zman biur, so then it's considered, it becomes osir. Apparently it's a shtuk of machlokas. I don't understand this, but let's say that once the zman biur comes, if you still have it in your house, it becomes osir. So then, or maybe that's what we're talking about when we're talking about osir. We're talking about maybe stuff that you kept in your house after the zman biur, then it actually becomes osir. So then, so at that point, it's davar she'ein lo matirin, and then we're saying it would be what? B'nosein tam. So then it would be only, osa b'nosein tam, which is a shear, if it gives flavor, if it imparts flavor. Okay? No, so what do we see? So we saw though, that this onion from the 6th year, that you then put into the ground in the 7th year, and it grew some. And now we're saying that the Shemitah is going to be mevatel the initial state, so we see that the additional growth is being mevatel the ikr, the initial state. Hanami l'chum shiny. But still, we could say here that it's a stringency. Meaning it's not necessarily, meaning in this case, we're taking an onion from the 6th year, planting it into the ground after the 7th year, and the additional growth is being mevatel, the mutter status from the 6th year. And we are saying that, right, that the initial growth is being mevatel, but maybe that's only because it's being stringent, right? It's being mevatel to say that we now have to treat it like a onion of the 7th year and say that it's also, as opposed to, in the case of Ishmael, the man, or should we say Ishmael, the man of the village of the sea. That's like, as Reb Dennis pointed out the other day, Ishmael was the narrator of Moby Dick. So maybe it's like Ishmael from the Sefer Moby Dick, that he's a man of the village of the sea. Ishmael, the man of the village of the sea, Nantucket. Ishmael, the man of the village of the sea. So in the case of Ishmael, the man of the village of the sea, so his onion, he had an onion, and that was from Shemitah that then planted in the 8th year, and by saying that the new growth would be mevatel the initial growth, it would be a kula. I don't know that we would necessarily learn that from this case with the onion of the 6th year and the 7th year. Ishmael, the man of the village of the sea. Maybe that could be the name of a book. Friends, it's all coming together. The title of the book is Ishmael, the man of the village of the sea, and it opens up a Kedushas Shvius onion it was, and a Kedushas Shvius onion it remained. Tell me you don't want to continue reading this book. Might not be at the top of my list, I'll be honest. Okay, what do you want me to tell you? Okay, we'll get there. Let's go weiter. Element Ada Pashta. Ishmael, the man of the village of the sea. Element Ada Pashta. Rather, answer it from here. Alright, the Tananis, we learned in the Mishnah. Bitzalim. Onions. I told you we were going to be talking about lots about onions. Okay. Sheyardu aleim gishamim. Now these are onions of the 7th year. Okay, these are onions of the 7th year. Vitzomchu, and they grew. Imhayu olin sheloyin shchorin. So if their leaves are black, right? So these are onions from the 6th year. That now they're like, I guess you put them back in the ground. I think there's different ways to understand it. It's not entirely clear, but let's say that you take onions of the 6th year and you put them back in the ground on the 7th year, and then it rains in the 7th year, v'tzomchu, and they grew, and then and then I guess you pull them out of the ground. Imhayu olin sheloin shcherin. If their leaves are black, asurin, they're also because, no, but here I don't think it's not talking about the Zman Abir. Here I assume it's talking about Kedusha Shvius, I guess. So they're considered from the 7th year, and they're asurin. If their leaves are black, because if their leaves are black, that's an indication that they got nourishment from the ground. And the ground, right? V'shavsa aretz. The ground is Kedusha Shvius. Horiku, but if the leaves are green, mutarin, well then they're mutar because the growth is coming from the onions themselves and not from the ground. Rabbi Chananya ben Antigonus Omer says, Rabbi Chananya ben Antigonus, Im yicholin li talish be'olin shaloin, if you could pull them out of the ground by their leaves, asurin, then they are asurin. Okay, fine, because then that means that the growth was from the 7th year. Chunegdan l'motzoi shviris mutarin, but the same thing would apply on motzoi shviris. That if you have onions of Shemitah, and then you I guess plant them on the 8th year and they grow and the leaves are black, so then they would be mutter on the 8th year. So maybe the gedulei heter malin iser. So we see that the growth of the 8th year, which is mutter, is being malin iser. It's nullifying the iser. So we see that this extra growth can nullify the ikr, the initial thing. We said hold your horses. Maybe the onions that we're talking about, where if they grow these black leaves, they can be mevatel the iser or whatever. Maybe that's talking about onions that were like crushed up. They were shver. They were shvach. So some black leaves can actually make a difference. So in the 8th year, if you have black leaves and you have crushed onions, so beseder, you can eat them. But if they were intact, geschmacke onions that you could fry up and put into I don't know, what do you do with fried onions? Well, somebody give me an example. What do you do with fried onions? And tell us in WhatsApp what you do with fried onions. But if you take these onions and you fry them up and put them into whatever somebody's going to tell us to put them into in WhatsApp, so then maybe that would be a different story. So maybe only because these are crushed and shver and shvach, that is why the leaves can make a difference. So rather learn out from here. The Tanya is imakusi. So a fellow is pruning a field with a kuti. Okay, fine. B'chasoyos, and these are with chasoyos. The Gemara is going to explain in a minute what chasoyos are. Ochel me'en achilas arai, so you can eat them achilas arai, right? Meaning, so if you're pruning stuff with a kuti, so as you're pruning, you can be eating them because, as you, right, things that, it's not yet chayev in, it's not yet considered tevel, right? Only once you do something like put it in a pile and flatten out the top of the pile, does it become chayev in tevel. It's not yet chayev in tevel. It's not yet tevel. It's not yet chayev in trumas ma'aser. So you can eat it as long as it isn't in a permanent manner. You can just, as you're pruning, you can be eating them. Uma'asun vade. Now, if somebody buys these things from right in the market, you're gonna have to separate meiser because kusim are suspect about separating meiser. Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Omer says, Reb Shimon ben Elazar, im Yisrael choshud al ashvius. Now, if it is shmita, and you have and you have the right. So if you have if you have a fellow who planted stuff during shmita, and meaning if you have a fellow who we have to be concerned that he may have planted stuff during shmita, and now it's the 8th year, so motzoi shvius mutter. So we're saying that on motzoi shvius it is permitted, right? So if you are pruning in a field of a Yisrael, of a Yid, on the 8th year, and we have to be concerned that this fellow may have planted these things illegally during the 7th year, so the motzoi shvius mutter. You would be able to eat the prunings. Oh no, is my light dying? Why should my light be dying? I thought it was full energy. I guess we'll find out, but I feel like I could tell when it's on the way out. Anyways, al shvius, so the motzoi shvius mutter. So he's going to be permitted to eat these prunings that he's pruning on the 8th year. Remember the gedule heter malin and sa'isr. Well, remember the gedule heter malin and sa'isr. So we see that the additional growth from the 8th year, and now you're pruning stuff in the 8th year, is being mile, it's nullifying the kedusha shvius from the previous year. So there you have it. So we see that the additional growth is mevatel the initial state. V'domu b'davar shezra'oi kole. But maybe that's davka by something, right? Maybe davka you're allowed to eat these prunings is because it's seeds that decompose. But we learned what are these chasayos, right? We said in the Brisa, amenachish makusi b'chasayos. What are chasayos? Kigon aluf, ve'ashum, ve'abtzolim, luf, garlic, onions. So we see that, and those are things she'ein davar, she'ein zro kol, that the seed does not decompose. Okay, so it's not talking about davar shezro kol. V'doma b'mduchanin. Maybe the reason why we say that the additional growth is okay is because we're talking about these things are crushed, and therefore they're kind of shver and shvach already. Choshur al shvius katan. Yeah, but it says that he's a fellow who is choshur al shvius, that he's not considered to be somebody who cares so much about shvius, so he's not going to go through this extra effort to plant these, to crush the things before planting them, so that they should be, so that it shouldn't be an issue. Maybe we're talking about where it was part of a mixture. So amenachish katani, yeah, but it says menachish. We're not talking about that he had these prunings and put them in a mixture or whatever. He's saying he's pruning, and as he's pruning, he's eating. So it's not any kind of mixture. No. So what do we see? So we seem to see from this example that if it's a Yisrael, we have to suspect that maybe he planted stuff during Shemitah, and now it's the 8th year, and where he's eating these prunings. So it must be that the additional growth is mevatel the original growth. So there you have it. So getting back to Ishmael, the man of the village of the sea, and his onion from Shemitah that he planted in the 8th year, we would say that just like this guy who's pruning in the 8th year, he's allowed to eat the prunings. So also the Ishmael, the man of the village of the sea, his onion that he planted in the 8th year, the additional growth should be able to be mevatel the initial state. So let's say that this is a kasha of Yochanan and Rabbi Yonasan, who said that the initial growth cannot be mevatel that the additional growth cannot be mevatel the initial state. Amr Yitzchok Shan Yeshvius. So Rabbi Yitzchak says, 1 second. This proof that you just brought from pruning on the 8th year, let's say that Shemitah is different. Hol v'isura al yedei karka b'teloso nami al yedei karka. That we could say that, look, since Shvius, the Isser of Shvius, of Shemitah, is a land-based thing, so therefore also the extra growth in the land could be mevatel Shvius. So therefore, even if this guy planted during the Shvius, the addition, and it would be Asur, but the additional growth during the 8th year could be mevatel. Hare Meiser the Isur Aide Karka. What about Trumas Meiser? That it is Asur Aide Karka, right? So if you have a guy, he plants stuff, and that comes from the ground, and then afterwards he separates the Truma, and then he separates Meiser, and he gives the Meiser to the Levi, and then the Levi separates, where am I? Where am I? Bari Meiser. The Surah de Karka. Right, so if we have, sorry, let me go over that. So if you have a situation of, you have a guy, he plants stuff, and he separates Truma, and he separates Meiser, and he gives the Meiser to a Levi. Now that Levi, that Meiser that the Levi receives is tevel for him. He can't eat it immediately. He has to separate Meiser from that, 10% of that, and give that to the Kohen. Only once he does that can he eat the Meiser that he received. So that Isser comes from the ground, right? It grew from the ground. And yet, Yisur Aide Karka, Ve'em B'Telos Aide Karka, and you cannot be mevatel it by planting it in the ground. The Tanya is within the a litra Meiser tevel. So if you have a measure of Meiser that's tevel, meaning a fellow had a field, he separated Truma, he separated Meiser, give the Meiser to the Levi. The Levi has not yet separated Truma's Meiser, so it's tevel for him. Shezra Bakarka, that he plants it in the ground, Ve'eshbicha, and it grew. Ve'arehi ke'eser litra. Now it's 10 times that amount. And chayev is b'meiser v'shvius. So we're saying it's still chayev in meiser and uvashvius and in shvius, and we're assuming that, and we're talking about where it actually is shmita right now. So therefore, all this extra stuff is hefker, because it grew during shmita, so therefore it's hefker. But he still needs to separate that trumas meiser that he never separated. And then that meiser min meiser that he had never separated, he still needs to separate from some other place, because since this stuff grew, so we don't know exactly what's considered like the new growth, or what's considered the tevel that needs to be separated from. So he takes some other Meiser that's tevel that needs to be separated, and he separates the equivalent amount that he would have had to separate from here, and he gives that to the Kohen. So the point is that even though it's growing, and even though the Isser of this Meiser tevel came from the ground, still when you replant it, it's not being bottled from the ground. To which the Gemara says, no, it's not the karka. It's not the Isser doesn't come from the ground. The Isser comes from the digun, right? When it becomes dagan, when you put it in a pile and you flatten out the top, when you do meruach, so that's when it becomes dagan, and that's when it becomes Asur right? And that's when it becomes, tevel. So it's not necessarily that it's coming from the ground, it's coming from the digun, and therefore, since it's from digun, the karka would not able to be mevatel it. Okay, but if it did come from the ground, so then growth would be able to be mevatel the iser. All right, friends, that was daf nun ches of Masechta Nedarim. So we continued on our quest to see if our friend Ishmael, the man of the village of the sea, and his onion that grew some on the 8th year, if the 8th year growth could be mevatel the 7th year growth. And so we had gotten to the consensus that it could. That was daf nun ches of Masechta Nedarim. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out.